The next up, we've got B. Moorhead. B is the Executive Director of Texas Impact, a statewide religious grassroots network whose members include individuals, congregations, and governing bodies of the Christian, Jewish, and Muslim faiths. She's also the Executive Director of the Texas Interfaith Center for Public Policy. And I notice I have someone seated between you. I should say that there's between you two, that there's been a little bit of some disagreement in the community of advocates over some of the particulars of the legislation that we're addressing, and so I hope you can speak to that and anything else you like in your allotted time.
All right. Well, I appreciate being invited to participate as well. I guess for the purposes of this panel, although I'm representing the faith community, we have a pastor who's also representing the faith community. So I think I'm going to try to set out as clearly as possible why Texas Impact supports the legislation that our Councilmember Spellman. I thought you were saying you had put in between us because he's both of our teachers.
Oh no, I just didn't want to get to it. I have to forget.
That's fun.
I'll spoken like a true reporter.
Right.
Very good.
You know, I think we have at least a particular perspective, Texas Impact does, and part of that perspective is probably my own personal perspective, coming from the LBJ school and coming from kind of a numbers policy background. So my policy background is in state budget, and so when I look at a policy issue, a lot of times the first thing that I will think about is what the fiscal implications of the policy are. So that's been the way that we've approached this issue a lot, has been as a fiscal policy issue. I'll start by saying there's a difference between regulating and outlawing an industry, and I think that one of our big concerns has been the need to keep talking about regulating an industry that it is true already exists, rather than outlawing or severely constraining an industry that a lot of people think is gross. There are a lot of industries in Texas that are regulated and nobody likes them, or I mean some people like them or they wouldn't make money, but we'd rather not talk about them. Payday lending is potentially one of those things, but it is an industry that exists. It exists because there's a demand for it. And while it's true that the payday industry, the way that it exists in Texas, is a relatively new thing, the basic need and the basic parameters for payday lending and things like it are very old. The idea that people lack access to money and they will go to someone who will let them have it at what will be a future high cost, that's not new news. That's an old practice. That's why we have usury laws in the first place. But it comes from a lot of larger issues, right? I mean, part of the reason that people go, in fact, I think a lot of the reason that people go to payday lenders is because of medical bills. Well, the legislature, oddly, is also debating legislation that would provide health insurance to a lot of people who currently go get payday loans to pay for medical expenses that people who have insurance would never worry about. So it's a little bit, I think from our perspective, not fair to look at just this one issue and say, well, this one thing is bad, so we need to come down hard on it, when it actually is in relationship to a lot of bad circumstances. And there is no denying that for a lot of people in Texas, payday lending seems like a rational strategy. So we thought that the best way to approach the issue was to look at the numbers and to see, would there be legislation that would actually, sort of setting aside what you think about the lenders and setting aside whether you think it's not fair that people can take advantage of other people or whatever, would there be a way to save borrowers money in payday lending? So could you have legislation that would result in clear, measurable benefit to the people who appear to be injured currently? And the answer, I think, is yes. And we actually think the legislation that had an exciting day in the Senate, would do that. So currently, you have to, I think about, of all the payday loans that are issued in the state right now, most of them are what are called classic payday loans. They're a single payment transaction where somebody goes in and gets money, and then 2 weeks later, they're supposed to go back and pay it off. And about half the time, that is actually what happens. The person gets the money, they know what they're getting into, they go back in 2 weeks, they pay it off, and Bob's your uncle. The other half of the time, those people, there's something happens, there's a snag, and they have to go back and roll the loan over. And when that happens, they roll it over often a lot of times. The number that the regulatory body, that the OCC, the Office of Consumer Credit Commissioner, sort of caps out their reporting on is 10 loans, so that 10 times rolled over. But I talked to a woman last fall who had rolled her loan over. She was well into the second year of rolling her loan over. So this was someone who had gotten a $1,000 loan, and for 2 years she had been going in and paying a fee every 2 weeks to not have to pay that $1,000. The benefit to the legislation that's been offered is it cuts off that opportunity for endless rollovers. It is a huge benefit because most of the market is those loans. It prevents the worst excesses. It doesn't do everything for everyone. I mean, there are people who are going to go in and they are going to know that they're taking out a loan at a very high interest rate. They want that money and they're going to go ahead and take it, and in a couple weeks they're going to go back and pay it off, and they are maybe going to go back and do that again after that. But for the people who got in over their heads and are now potentially going to drown in this debt over a long period of time, the legislation that was introduced and had its excitement today would cut off the worst excesses and put us on a path to some sort of regulation, and that's why we support it.